But even if you don't believe all the stuff at the Pentagon, let's have a look at Flight 93. Flight 93 disappeared off the radar over Cleveland, Ohio. It was reported on local television and confirmed by the mayor that Flight 93 had landed that morning at Cleveland Airport in Ohio. So what are we talking about what happened in Shanksville? What's this story about the passengers taking control of the plane, about them making calls to their loved ones? Well, one thing, it is impossible to make mobile phone calls from civilian aircraft. Absolutely impossible. We don't know where these voice recordings come from, but they are a physical impossibility. So that, again, undermines a key plank of the official story. We also now have a US general who has said the US Air Force did shoot down an object over Shanksville heading towards Washington. He has said this on the public record. He is not being interviewed by the American government or the 9/11 Commission. So that is our key evidence. So this guy's an ex-colonel. He, in fact, in an article, names the pilot involved, and the pilot is interviewed. He doesn't deny it. That is obviously not absolute proof, but it's pretty good proof, basically, that that whatever was heading towards Washington was actually shot down. And shot down by the American military in contravention of the orders of the civilian government, who appeared to be very happy to allow that object to go down on Washington. Now let's think about it. I want to just take a pause to say how important that was, that plane was shot down, or that object was shot down. If that had gone through, and you'd destroyed Capitol Hill or the White House, they could have very easily turned around and said, right, martial law. America has been attacked, its military infrastructure has been attacked, trade and civilians have been attacked at the World Trade Center, and crucially, our government infrastructure has been attacked. We are now entitled to take emergency powers, take control of the free press and so on, because there is such a threat to our country in the absence of a proper government. And anybody who finds that fanciful, I refer them to the Miami Herald of the 10th of September 2001, in which it is reported that Jeb Bush declared martial law in Florida. He jumped the gun, basically. But that is a matter of public record, not conspiracy theory, a matter of public record. So clearly that was the plan. Because the American military shot this object down, they couldn't make that argument. Democracy was in that moment saved. Because if it hadn't, they could have gone straight into Iraq, straight into Iran, and we wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. Because they had to justify it to their own people, it took longer to go into Iraq, and they're still having problems with going into Iran. Effectively, the American military at that point saved world democracy. And we should be grateful for people who would make that decision. And even if there had been people on that plane, it was still the right decision to make. If you've got 80, 100 people on a plane, 300 people on a plane, you still shoot those people down, because if that plane goes over a city and comes down, it could kill 1,000, 10,000 people. So it is the right moral decision as well. There should be no shame in people making what are hard decisions, but ultimately moral decisions for the most number of people to survive, basically. Now, of course, people will say, of course, that bin Laden has confessed to 9/11. No, he hasn't. All the videos you've seen of bin Laden are clearly fakes. Clearly fakes. In fact, bin Laden's actually denied 9/11 and said he couldn't do it because the people in Afghanistan wouldn't let him. The government there wouldn't let him carry out an attack like 9/11. Now, I think we've got to be careful what we're talking about with 9/11. Some people say Bush did it. I don't think so. I think Bush was a patsy, too stupid to know what was going on. Certainly, though, people like Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, these people knew what was going on. In fact, they planned it. How do we know that? Because of evidence in the public domain. Certainly, in normal circumstances in a counter-terrorist investigation, or in fact any criminal investigation, you show any prior knowledge whatsoever of a future crime, you become a prime suspect. That's the way investigations work. Yeah? So, in September 2000, the project for the new American century, which includes Cheney, Jeb Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, all these neocons, write a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses. They crucially admit that America has a massive appetite for energy, and that they can only secure energy by having a gas pipeline across Afghanistan, by having control of the oil supply in Iraq and Iran. And the only way they can do this is through military occupation. That's the only way they can create the security to do it. But they know that the good people of America in normal circumstances will not accept an invasion of the Middle East. They say absent a catastrophic and cataclysmic event, like a new Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was obviously what prompted the Americans going into the Second World War. Absent an event like that, it's not going to happen. It's going to take a long, long time. Well, I believe that 9/11 was that new Pearl Harbor. That in plans laid down by genuine Islamic terrorists, let's not have a rosy-tinted view of Islam either. There are people within Islam whose perverted interpretation of it think they can indiscriminately kill innocent human beings. And indeed, Al-Qaeda may have planned to fly planes into buildings in the US, but they are just not capable of doing that. In those plans, elements of the project for the new American century, elements of the FBI, elements of the CIA, saw an opportunity to carry out an attack and blame it on those Islamic terrorists. And also used an opportunity to cover stuff up. On the 10th of September 2001, Donald Rumsfeld announced in a press conference that $2.3 trillion had gone missing from the American defence budget. And to give you an idea of how vast that sum of money is, our gross domestic product over 15 months, which is the entire wealth of all of us that we create within 15 months, is about equivalent to that sum. It's more than a third of the Americans' national debt, in fact. So a vast, vast sum of money has gone missing from the defence budget. Yet somehow Rumsfeld knew to release that on the 10th of September, knowing that in America, because the attacks happened early in the morning, no one was going to pick up a newspaper and read about it. How do you know it was going to be a great day to bury bad news? Again, that indicates possible inside knowledge and something for which he should be interviewed. Now, I'd say with all this 9/11 stuff, there's obviously a lot of information to take in. Please go and do your own research. Don't just believe me. There is a vast array of research out there you can find off the internet. Some good, some bad. Obviously, you've got to make your own decisions up about what you choose to use and to look at. Now, in the case of 7/7, there is less evidence than 9/11. Clearly, they've learned that you don't carry out terrorist attacks in broad daylight because anoraks like me analyse them. We slow down the footage, we look at all the stuff, and that's no good. That leaves a trail of evidence that people can contradict the official story with. So 7/7, 3 bombs underground. No one can see anything that's going on down there. Very few witnesses, certainly no television cameras, no CCTV cameras. The ideal situation. But of course you do need some visuals, don't you? You need visuals so you can put something on the front page. So the bus, the number 30 bus, the only bus that day to be rerouted, is rerouted to Tavistock Square and is, of course, blown up, so they get the visuals. Now again, I was saying about terrorist attacks. In normal circumstances, the closer you are to the scene of a terrorist attack, the more of a prime suspect you are until the police rule you out of their inquiries. That's the way it works. I know that. I've worked in the services. So why is it that there is a van parked next to the number 30 bus belonging to a company called Kingstar, who specialise in silent, controlled demolition? Why is it that the driver of that van, as far as we can see, has never been interviewed by police? Why has that van never been forensicated? Why has the director of the company never been interviewed? Why is it on the side of that bus is an advert for a film called The Descent? And one of the quotes praising the film from the press, outright terror, bold and brilliant. But it gets worse. Why is it the serial number of the bus, not the registration number, the serial number of the bus, the middle 3 numbers are 775, the date of the attack? What is going on here? Needless to say, of course, none of this has been dealt with by the police properly or by the Home Office inquiry. In fact, to give you an idea of, well, in fact, the Home Office inquiry is not an inquiry at all, it's just a narrative put forward. And to give you an idea of how flimsy this narrative is, there are some amazing lines in this narrative. At one point, they say, there are no CCTV pictures of Shazad Tanweer on the Piccadilly Line platform. But he must have got into the second carriage, because that's where the bomb went off. It's not, there's no pictures of him there, so he might not be there. Now, if somebody working for me in MI5 had written that, I'd have to report them to management, because clearly they were letting their prejudices overrule the evidence and their good judgment. Similarly, in the official report, they show Leeds, they show Luton, they show London. They show a very clear line joining the 3. And underneath, in the narrative, it says, the route taken by the bombers. Based on what evidence? One CCTV picture, which has never been released to the public, taken at Woodall Services, not that far down the M1. Now, obviously, the M1 is the most likely route you take in those circumstances, but of course, in the services, you are taught to assume nothing. And the very fact they are making these assumptions shows that they are clearly trying to put into our minds that those four guys were in that area that day. What about the other evidence that's supposed to show this? The 721 picture taken at Luton. Now, I've been at Luton to check this out. That picture is a physical impossibility. The guy with the hat on near the railings would have to be 4 foot, 4'6" tall, for it to make any sense. The railings are so low. But crucially, he's standing in front of the railings, except one of them goes in front of his arm. Now, what the hell is going on there? Clearly, that can't be natural. What's more worrying is it would be easier to forge a picture with the railing going behind his arm. So we've got to wonder why we have this very peculiar picture. Again, we've got to wonder why and again, we know this is the real picture because it's the one used in the official report. It cannot be a doctored picture. Again, we've got to wonder why the official bodies looking at this didn't say, well, hang on, what's the problem there? We've also got to wonder why the official bodies included the time of the train they got from Luton as being 7:40. Nobody in the mainstream media checked this. We did in the 9/11, 7/7 truth movements and found that 7:40 had been cancelled that day. So they couldn't have got that train. Yet that was in the official timeline. It's only come out recently that the Home Secretary has accepted that that train was cancelled, so the men could not have been on that train. But then we have a witness report to them being on the 7:48. So it's okay, they could have got the 7:48. Except the 7:48 didn't get in on time for them to be able to carry out the bombings at the time they said they happened. And of course, crucially, we now wonder, why were there witnesses saying these men were on the 7:48? And clearly they couldn't have been. Clearly, well, my belief is that these were planted witnesses, in the same way as they did in the Jean-Charles de Menonès fiasco at Stockwell. At Stockwell Tube, there was a witness who says to the media, I saw him jump over the barriers. This man cannot be traced. He's disappeared off the face of the earth. Clearly, what they've done is planted one of their people in there to get their story in there and to get the headlines in the papers. And this is what I think they did with 7/7. They created a narrative around 7/7, around those attacks. But that narrative was undermined by the failures of the British Rail Service, ironically. Our lack of investment in the transport infrastructure may bring down the New World Order in a way we could never have imagined. But of course there's more evidence and more of this, what we now call coincidence theory. On the day of 7/7, I was probably the only person heading into London. Everybody else was coming out after the bombings. I was going up to London to give an interview, because I work on the sort of probabilities. If there'd been 4 attacks that day already, there weren't going to be any more. I was going to be safe. And I heard on Radio 5 Live someone called Peter Power from a company called Visor Consultants saying he'd been running a counter-terrorist training exercise that day involving exactly the same stations in a similar scenario to one that actually happened. Now, I heard this and my blood ran cold, because on 9/11 the Pentagon had been running an anti-terrorist training exercise which involved flying a plane into the Pentagon, what actually happened that day. There were many other counter-terrorist training exercises that day in the US. In fact, it appears to be a hallmark of these false flag operations now that you need a distraction of a counter-terrorist training exercise, and for a very good reason. In Russia, in September 1999, there were a series of attacks that were blamed on the Chechens, until the Russian Domestic Security Service were discovered planting bombs in buildings. And what do they say? Oh, these aren't real bombs, we're just doing a counter-terrorist training exercise. That's why they do them, to cover up if they get caught. So the chance of this actual training exercise on 7/7 involving the same stations runs into trillions, quadrillions to 1. Alex Jones, the famous American disc jockey, has looked at this. He's got an actuary to look at the chances of this, and it runs way beyond, I think, quadrillions to 1, basically. And yet, Peter Power, of course, has never been interviewed by police or interviewed by the people writing the Home Office narrative. And more peculiar with 7/7 as well is the nature of the explosives. Certainly, witness reports talk about metal being pushed up into the tube carriages. Now, that's not absolute confirmation the bombs were placed underneath, but it certainly makes it more likely than that they were actually within the carriage. What is also interesting is that the French head of counter-terrorism who was working with British police said that it was military-grade explosive. In the British press, on the record, he said that. Now, at this point, no one knew anything about the explosives. He was working with them, he knew what he was talking about, and I think he was trying to alert us to a false flag operation. It's 2 days after that that homemade explosive is found in the cars at Luton, in the bomb-making factory up in Leeds. But of course, that could have very easily been planted. And it's enormously suspicious that they have not actually, in fact, identified the explosive substance used. I know from being in the services, there's only certain substances used to blow things up. They haven't revealed details of that. And the reason that this explosive is important, the military-grade stuff, is that it is C4 explosive. C4 explosive was used by the Gladio teams. Who's heard of Gladio? Operation Gladio took place after the Second World War. It was designed as stay-behind armies in the event of a Soviet invasion. They wanted the resistance movements of the Soviets to be well-armed, well-tooled with explosives. So they were given explosives and arms, they put in caches. However, due to inquiries carried out by the Belgian Parliament and the Italian Parliament, we now realise that these Gladio teams, which were directed by MI6 and NATO, were in fact carrying out terrorist attacks in Europe and blaming it on left-wing extremist groups. There was a whole series of false flag terrorist operations, the most crucial one of which was the kidnapping and assassination of Aldo Moro in Italy. There was about to be a vote of confidence in the Italian government. They were about to collapse. And for the first time in history, in Western Europe, there was to be a democratic, communist government. Now, they couldn't let Aldo Moro vote on this, so they kidnapped him and killed him. They then blamed it on communist guerrillas. Why would communist guerrillas be stopping somebody from going to effectively vote to create the first democratic communist government in Europe? It doesn't make any sense. An Italian inquiry has now shown that NATO and MI6 were behind this, not just in Italy, but in other countries. So it is possible that C4 explosive was used, and that 7/7 was in fact a Gladio operation. So what is the effect of all of this? The effect of false flag terrorism, obviously, was to justify the invasions of the Middle East and so on. But crucially, it is also to scare the living daylights out of us, for a number of reasons. If we live in fear, we don't do things as well. We make more mistakes. We don't trust people. We're less effective at gathering together and sharing information and resisting tyranny. Many people who are in a state of fear are also more prepared to accept the curtailment of liberties we normally enjoy. But it's also, of course, as well about creating anger towards the Muslim community. Again, creating those dark energies and so on. But we must also bear in mind that amongst all this darkness, and we are living in very dark times by the standards of human civilization, very, very dark times. But in that darkness, there is enormous light. And the light is that every time they do something, they cock it up. They've cocked up 9/11. They've cocked up 7/7. They've cocked up the invasion of Afghanistan. They've cocked up the invasion of Iraq, and they couldn't go into Lebanon. And because those things have happened, more and more people are waking up. More and more people are starting to realise that false flag terrorism is a fact. That we should not be looking at Islamic terrorists as the main threat to our country. Yes, they do exist, but they're not an enormous threat. The main threat to our liberty and our democracy is the dark elements of the New World Order, who are carrying out these operations and blaming innocent Muslims, or using them as a distraction. We'll all remember the recent events that began on the 10th of August, 10/8. Not 11/9, 10/8 this time. When everybody was going on holiday, of course. And they told us they were going to blow up airliners over our skies. Those guys didn't even have passports, didn't have airline tickets. You can't make liquid explosive like that. I've talked to an explosives expert who told me, you've got to store this stuff for 24 hours. You've got to let it settle and so on. So this isn't time. And what are you going to do? Take your Thomas Salter chemistry kit to the toilet and start making these things? I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. It really is. And this is why they use these very flimsy terrorist laws to charge people, because it then stops anybody exposing that, because it's sub judice. The editor of The Independent wanted to run a story saying the things I've just said, saying these guys are innocent, and he was told by the government he would be prosecuted and put in prison if he ran that story. This is the sort of situation we are in at the moment. So I'd say to people, do not get depressed by this. Please, embrace it. Go out and do your own research. Do what you can. Share DVDs with friends. Because the only way you really change the world is by changing hearts and minds. And politics has failed to do that in this country over the last 20, 30 years. This will change people's minds because they have a very clear idea of what happened on 9/11, and you can very, very easily change that opinion to the exact opposite. So hopefully they will then start to look at other areas of alternative evidence and research to do with UFOs, to do with alternative energy, to do with a whole series of issues that affect us at the moment. And usually I've got to say, well, in every case, once people have awoken to 9/11, they don't go back. We don't have a single case of a member in our movement who said, hang on, yeah, the official story's right, I'm giving up this. Not one. And once you go through it, of course, you realise you've got a duty to expose this tyranny. Because if you don't do it, they will carry on using these false flag operations to instill more fear, to manipulate the news agenda. A good example of this was with George Bush, when he was up in Sedgefield a few years ago, and the peace movement had made his life hell there. The headlines across the world were going to be, you know, peace movement embarrasses Bush. It was going to be the peace movement's finest hour. That day, a lorry bomb was driven into the British embassy in Ankara. So all the headlines were again about Islamic terrorism. That was obviously a false flag operation designed to spare the embarrassment of Tony Blair and George Bush. And that is what they'll do if we get a breakthrough. They will use and manipulate the media like that. And of course the time really to do things is not at some nebulous point in the future. Please, now you've heard this, go out and try and change the world around it. Say it's not difficult to do it, really. It is so obvious to expose this. And bear in mind, if I could just finish on this one note, bear in mind the words of Edmund Burke from the 18th century, and I hope that we can all take to heart in this. And those words are, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Thank you.